Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Pursuit of Equity, Teacher Preparation for the Inclusion of Students with Disabilities in Career and Technical Education. Today's webinar is the fourth and final webinar in our series focused on supporting and promoting college and career readiness opportunities for students with disabilities. Recordings of our previous webinars can be found on our website at ccrscenter.org under the Events tab. My name is Ellen Cushing, and I'm the Deputy Director of the College and Career Readiness and Success Center. The CCRS Center is a federally funded technical assistance center charged with supporting state and local education agencies in their college and career readiness efforts, including supporting the development of employability skills, creating work-based learning opportunities, supporting post-secondary preparedness, and aligning the education to workforce pipeline. And we do this work by providing a range of technical assistance support to our stakeholders. Throughout today's webinar, there will be several opportunities to engage with our presenters. The first is by using the chat box function located on the right-hand side of the screen. You can also use the raise hand function, which is also located on the right-hand side of your screen. Finally, we will share a recording of the webinar today, as well as sending out a post-event feedback survey where we can get feedback on your experience and any outstanding questions that you might have related to this topic. And now I'd like to turn over the webinar to today's moderator and my colleague, Jamar Nellums.
Thank you, Ellen. We are really glad that you could all join us today. And we are very excited about our agenda and our panelists. And so I'd like to start off with letting you know what our agenda will be. But I also want to strongly encourage you, if you have questions, even now and as our speakers are speaking, please feel free to put them into the box indicated by Ellen. Our agenda today, we will start with the welcome and the introductions, and we will hear from Dr. Tessie Bailey and Dr. Roddy Theobald on why this is so important and relevant for students with disabilities and their post-secondary readiness and success. Then the core of today's webinar will be our panel of perspectives from the field. And today we'll have representatives from Washington, the state, Georgia, and Minnesota. And throughout the panel, we'll present the panelists with questions that you have asked, as well as some additional guiding questions if time permits. And then we will hear the national perspective, which will summarize what we've heard from our panelists, as well as highlight themes and recommendations, and additional questions and answers from you as the audience as time permits. Today's presenters is listed on this slide, and I will I will introduce the panelists as we get closer to their run-throughs. But we're going to start off today with Dr. Tessie Bailey and Dr. Roddy Theobald on why this matters. So I'm turning it over to Tessie.
Thank you, Jamar. And I'm really honored to be here today, kicking off the content portion of our last webinar in our series. And if you've participated in our previous webinars, you know that we have really focused on highlighting a number of benefits of CTE participation for students with disabilities. On the next slide, what you'll notice is that the benefits really range from school success. We see increased attendance, we see lower dropout rates, increased graduation, and more quality IEPs. We also see a greater success in the post-school arena, which is what a lot of us care about, is increased employment post-school. We also see increased success in post-secondary education and in community participation. In the chat box, you'll see that there are a number of resources that will be shared, but one I'd like to highlight is a one-pager from CCRS Center that highlights a lot of the benefits of including students with disabilities in CTE. There are a number of reported challenges that you'll see on the next slide that we've identified through the research. The National Center on Special Education Research and the National Center on Ed Research found these, as well as one other barrier to including students with disabilities. In our initial implementation of our series, we surveyed participants and identified these as the top 3, and those are the ones that have really sort of outlined our series. 48% of our participants identified that CTE programs don't really provide the needed support. You're going to hear from Georgia today on our panel, who's going to talk about some of the things that they've been doing to increase student success once they're in CTE. And then if you check back with our first webinar, you'll see some other strategies that states have been doing. The last bullet, which is there's a lack of collaboration within and across state education agencies, including special ed, general ed, and voc rehab, were addressed very extensively in our webinar 2 and 3, and I highly recommend checking those out if that's something that is a challenge in your state. But the second most reported barrier to participation is really CTE training is inadequate. And it's not just CTE teachers, but it also includes special ed teachers and general ed teachers that work together to support students with disabilities gaining access to CTE as well as being successful in CTE. So I'm going to pass this over to my colleague Roddy, who's going to share a little bit about the research.
Thank you, Tessie. So my job today is to provide a little bit of background about why we might be hearing from folks about concerns about CTE teacher training, and particularly why that might impact students with disabilities. Just a little bit of background about the CTE teacher labor market, given that it's so different than labor markets for other teachers. Recently, about 2/3 of states in the country reported shortages of CTE teachers. And what we see in the data as a common response to that is to issue far more temporary or emergency teaching licenses in CTE than in other subjects. In Washington, where I'm located, when we look at the administrative data, over half of all teachers who teach CTE courses in the state only have a conditional or probationary certification, which means they have not received formal teacher training. And this is relative to fewer than 1% of teachers who teach core academic classes who don't have formal teacher training. Then even within teachers, CTE teachers who have formal teacher education, there are a number of different potential pathways to licensure. In Washington, for example, there's a separate business and industry route that allows CTE teachers to teach without a bachelor's degree, but instead with prior employment experience. We're very lucky to have Kim Bartell, a faculty member at the largest CTE teacher training program in Washington, on the webinar today, who will tell you a little bit more about those different paths in Washington. Now, nothing about what I just said necessarily implies inadequate training, but there are some reasons why we might think that these patterns would influence students with disabilities. First of all, teachers are very important, but also recent evidence suggests that high-quality teachers disproportionately impact outcomes for students with disabilities. This is recent research coming out of Washington by our research team. And the other reason we might worry about this is that there's some evidence that CTE teachers just don't feel prepared to serve students with disabilities in their classrooms. For example, CTE teachers report that they feel less confident about teaching students with disabilities than their administrators think they are, and that newly hired CTE teachers are sometimes surprised by seeing students with disabilities in their classrooms. So that provides the background for the discussion today. I'm going to pass this back to Jamar, who's going to introduce our panel.
Thank you. So today's panel, we have Dr. Kimberly Bartell from Central Washington University, where she's a professor in the College of Education and Professional Studies. We have Scott Chafin, who's a program manager for career, technical, and agricultural education out of the Georgia Department of Education. We have Paula Polacek, who is with the Special Populations Group and a program specialist, also with CTE out of the Georgia Department of Education. And we have Troy Hogan, who is a CTE coordinator for Lakes County Service Cooperatives out of Minnesota Department of Education, and Lynn Holdeheide, who is a managing technical assistant consultant for the American Institutes for Research, and also serves on the Center for Great Teachers and Leaders, as well as the Collaboration for Effective Educator Development, Accountability, and Reform, also known as the CEDAR Center. So we want to welcome all of our panelists with us here today. We're going to start off with Dr. Bartell, who will give us some highlights of what's happening in the state of Washington.
Well, thank you, and it's really an honor to be involved with this presentation. I've been a CTE teacher and teacher preparation professor for 36 years, and I'm always looking for ways to improve. And I'll begin this part of the presentation by saying Central Washington University, the CTE teacher education program is certainly looking to improve in this area. So I'd like to describe the two different pathways that Roddy mentioned earlier for how our CTE teachers get certification, and then we'll talk more specifically about how we're preparing our teachers for working with students with disabilities. So we have two different routes, that, as we call them. Oops, let me go back here. We have two different routes. The traditional route is also referred to as Plan 1, and it's what most of you are familiar with, where it's university-based. It leads to a bachelor's degree. It's your traditional undergraduate studies. They take coursework specifically in CTE, 66 to 68 credits, and that's the CTE subject matter. And our different areas are business, marketing, information technology. That's one of our programs. Our second program is family and consumer sciences, and our third program is technology education. And all of these programs integrate CTE pedagogy and curriculum development, very specific to CTE. The students in this program also complete what we call the professional education program, which is the equivalent of a second major in secondary education. And it's in those classes that they take their general pedagogy along with all other education majors, the methods, curriculum development, classroom management, multicultural education, school law, all of those things. And then they also do field experience through that program. And that includes classroom observations, what we call an autumn experience, and student teaching. For our traditional Plan 1 students to be certified in CTE, they have a requirement of 2,000 hours of related work experience. And as most of you know, 2,000 hours is the equivalent of 1 year of full-time work experience. When they finish this program, they actually are certified to teach all CTE-related courses in their area. And that's important as we start to talk about Plan 2, which is what we call more of a business and industry route. This is program-based. This is either a 1 or 2 year program that leads to CTE certification. It's certificate-based, not degree granting. And typically what happens is the students the classes meet one Saturday per month during the academic year. And then there are also practicum requirements where they spend a lot of time out in the classrooms. In the first year of the program, the first year is designed for non-certified candidates that are coming from business and industry. So these are people who have no teaching background, no education degree. A bachelor's degree is not required, although some of our candidates do have a bachelor's degree. They're coming from maybe an accounting background or something like that. The first year of the Plan 2 program covers basic pedagogy, your methods, your classroom management, etc. In year 2, all of our candidates, our business and industry route candidates, are required to complete. So, in year 2, we bring in, we add to that mix a lot of teachers who are already certified. So a really common candidate coming into year 2 would be a STEM teacher who wants to get CTE certified. And so year 2 is very CTE focused. We talk about leadership, we talk about school to work, CTE regulations. So the year 2 is completed by both our year 1 candidates and previously certified but not CTE teachers. We also have just begun offering a summer intensive program, and this is for year 2, not year 1. It meets 5 days face-to-face, so 5 days in a row, 1 week, the students come to class from 8 o'clock to 5 o'clock. And then the following 4 weeks, they meet online. And that's the equivalent of the year 2 material. For our Plan 2 teachers, they are required to have 6,000 hours of related work experience. And again, that would be the equivalent of a minimum of 3 years. And there are also some rules and regulations. For example, those 3 years have to have occurred within the past 6 years. The interesting part of the Plan 2 is that they are certified to teach only CTE courses that are specific to their work experience. We call those V codes. So with our Plan 1 students, they're certified to teach any course in their area, but with Plan 2, they can only teach in the areas that they have that work experience. So the third slide, let me go back, covers how we prepare our students to prepare our candidates to serve students with disabilities. With the traditional university route, they have required courses including students with exceptionalities, educating linguistically diverse students, and then with our CTE School to Work course, we do have 1 unit, and that covers students from special populations. Another requirement is in our Ed TPA that's required for all of our students. They have to submit artifacts and teaching demonstrations that are required for their successful student teaching. In planning rubric number 2, they have to provide documentation that they support varied student learning needs, and in rubric 4 they have to identify and support the areas of language demands among students. For our business and industry route, we cover school law and issues related to abuse, and that deals a little bit with students with disabilities. And then we also, in history and philosophy of CTE, we include students' materials, and we cover students from special populations. And I'll pass this back to the next presenters.
Excellent, thank you. And now we'll hear from Georgia.
Georgia would like to take this opportunity to say thank you for inviting us in to participate in the webinar. Georgia certainly understands and recognizes that student success comes from effective and quality teaching. And effective and quality teaching comes from effective teachers in the classroom, and we have determined that we need to support our teachers with instructional resources for success in the classroom. Georgia developed a strategic plan which contains 4 priorities, and one of those priorities is that Georgia recognizes the fact that we need to have counselors and teachers and counselors are central to the success in CTE for students and teachers. Georgia has developed a new teacher workshop where we have provide workshops for teachers and information and resources for first-year teachers and counselors. This past September, our workshop contained over 300 new teachers and counselors, and we'll have a follow-up workshop in December for those teachers as well.
Okay, we have every agreement with all of you that what the lack of CTE teacher preparation impacts, and how that, especially with our students with disabilities. And, you know, we know that CTE is oftentimes the hook that keeps those kids in school to graduate and to pursue a meaningful life and employment. So we know it's important to have relationships and programs in place to support not only the students but the teachers as well. So we do in Georgia have some traditional and non-traditional routes to teacher certification. which I have listed in our resources, and for the sake of time, I don't believe we're going to be able to go over all of those in depth. But in addition to that, there are a number of other supports. Scott mentioned the CTE Teacher Conference, but we also have a resource network with professional development workshops that teachers can participate in throughout the year, and that's for everybody in CTE. We have professional learning in a summer conference and a number of other opportunities as well. But one of the things that makes Georgia rather unique is that we have Career and Technical Instruction, CTI, which is a individualized and specialized intervention service specifically designed to support students with disabilities who are enrolled in CTE classes, with primary goals of providing support for them to gain those entry-level job skills that will take them to work and or post-secondary education. In addition to that, the students in those classes are learning self-advocacy skills and transition skills to help them along the way. Now, how does that happen? It happens with CTI coordinators who provide services to those students in the classroom. The CTI coordinators are special education certified teachers first who go through a training program that consists of about 100 hours of specialized training, knowledge of the workforce, economic development, high demand jobs, and what it takes for success in the CTE classrooms. So they are in there supporting those students with their accommodations and modifications and whatnot. Those teachers, as a part of their training, also take part in a one-year internship so that there's a monitoring process in place throughout that first year, and then supports that in years beyond that, excuse me. Additionally, we know that CTSOs are a very important part of CTE instruction and our pathway classes. So we have Georgia CTI specifically set up for our students with disabilities. Now, it acts as a bridge for students to move from Georgia CTI into the nationally recognized CTSOs that go along with their pathways and their classes that they're taking for career measures. But in Georgia CTI, we can provide a level playing field for students with disabilities to interact with peers just like themselves in conferences and in competitions and in other events and activities structured very intentionally to support student leadership, to support student competitive abilities, employability skills, and all of those traits that they're going to need for success in the future. So we feel like that's a real boost to our students with disabilities. It gives them a lot to be a part of, and it's very much inclusive. And our CTE teachers, that relationship building is just a win-win for everybody.
I'd like to add that you can find our strategic plan in the resources section of the presentation.
Excellent, thank you. And we already have some questions that are coming in, and so we encourage you to please continue asking in that question box, and we'll make sure that the presenters are able to respond. And so now, going from Washington to Georgia, and then Georgia to Minnesota, I turn it over to Troy Huygen.
Thanks, Jamar. Again, Troy Hogan. Welcome. Thank you so much for having this opportunity, and I appreciate that. And greetings from West Central Minnesota, where we do not have snow like everybody thinks we might. I'm going to, let's see here. There we go. Thank you, Jessica, for moving that slide around. So this first slide, I think I'm going to start from the back side and go to the front side. So Lakes Country Service Cooperative is one of 9 service cooperatives in Minnesota, which were statutorily created in the 70s. And our initial intention for us, our work, was basically to provide services for school districts that they don't oftentimes have the ability to do themselves. So you see the bottom right-hand corner is the map of the 9 service cooperatives area. I'm the purple one right in the middle on the west central side of Minnesota. So as a service cooperative, we're technically a school district. And we serve our 35 member school districts in our region. Doing some work around, just particularly around licensure, if you see the far left side graph, I did a survey a little over a year ago about our 35 school districts in our region about where their CTE teachers are as far as in their career, and come to find out that more than half will be retired within the next 11 to 15 years. 26% will be gone within the next 5 years. 6 to 10, about 20% will be gone within 6 to 10, and 11 to 15%. So if you look, we're almost a vast majority of our teachers will be retired at a short amount of time. If we juxtapose that with the information in the middle, the 5 licensures that I have listed under the CTE license, the teacher coordinator, work-based learning, construction careers, manufacturing careers, medical careers, transportation careers, in the 2016 school year, this is the number of licenses that were actually issued in Minnesota, and how many how many teachers were on special permissions. Special permissions at the time were variances, or they're not full licenses. They were granted to people that were either community experts or variances because they have other licenses. So if you look, we're really struggling. Right now, there's one institution in Minnesota that provides the teacher coordinator work-based learning endorsement. There is one institution that provides higher education institution that provides the construction careers, manufacturing careers, and transportation careers licenses. And that licensure program is actually a post-bac program to begin with. So we had literally 2 construction careers licenses issued in 16, 0 manufacturing careers licenses issued in 16, and 0 transportation careers licenses issued in 2016. And for medical careers, so the health occupation fields, we have 0 pathways, typical pathways to licensure in Minnesota. Now take a look at the top graph. This was a piece that struck me pretty hard. So we have this is the gap between the number of, or the percentage of, students of color in our region, in the 9 counties of west central Minnesota, which is the top graph, and the percentage of teachers of color in the bottom graph. That's a stark contrasting difference. We're a very pretty homogeneous white area, but as you see, our students of color are increasing, have been increasing since school year 12. To now we're here over 12% of our students are of color. And if we look at a number of teachers of color, we very literally in the 9 counties of our region have 1 teacher of color, which is a very sad testament to the work we're doing. And that's not just CTE teachers, that is teachers, period, in our K-12 public schools. Now, some things that have happened in Minnesota. So about two legislative sessions ago, the legislature completely revamped the entire licensure system into a tiered licensure structure, and it provided pathways for CTE teachers to become licensed in alternative ways, several alternative ways. One of those, additionally, they revised a statute that's been in place since 2012 called the Alternative Teacher Preparation Statute, and that Alternative Teacher Preparation Statute, up until July 1 of 18, was really it was really impossible to actually become an approved provider, simply because of the way the language was written, and the Board of Teaching at the time was regulating the process for which that statute was created. So through some legislative work, that statute was actually revised, as I said, in the 2017 session that took effect July 1 of 2018. And in essence, what that does, that Alternative Teacher Preparation Statute does, is allows for school districts, chartered schools, or education-related nonprofits that offer teacher preparation through alternative teacher preparation. We, as Lakes Country, as our service cooperative, we were just just awarded became the first alternative teacher preparation unit under the statute. We've never had a non-institution of higher education be awarded the ability to grant licenses in Minnesota. So that actually just happened about 2 weeks ago for us as Lakes Country. We are in the current, so that was the first step of the process, is to become a unit or an institutionally approved by what is now called the Professional Educator Licensing and Standards Board. As I said, the entire licensing system blew up about 2 years ago, and on January 1 of 2018, the former Board of Teaching was completely eliminated from every statutory language. It was eliminated, and a new board called the Professional Educator Licensing and Standards Board was created to start on January 1 of 2018. So we've really upset the apple cart. So through our second set of processes here is we're applying for what's called a request for initial program approvals, and our initial programs that we'll be offering for teachers in our region, or actually statewide, are work-based learning, CTE core, which is a required set of standards for any CTE careers licenses, which include construction careers, manufacturing careers, transportation careers, and medical careers. So we are in the process again of building the programs, those programs to be in place for approval from our licensing board, with the hope to start offering these programs in the not too distant future. But again, we are dealing with government bureaucracy. No offense to those people that work for government, but we don't know for sure when all of that's going to happen. So our process for our licensure is going to is intended to look very different than what a traditional process is. We are engaging with our folks around providing content through a micro-credential process. Micro-credentials are intended to be competency-based, that require evidence of our application of that application related to that discrete skill. So small pieces, small standards, and how can we ask a candidate to provide evidence that they can actually relate and understand that particular small skill. Micro-credentials are on demand. You can do them anytime, any place, online, on demand. It's intended to be as flexible as absolutely needed to be, because oftentimes most of our candidates that already have teaching license looking to add a CTE license, it's very difficult for them to be able to engage in a traditional setting. They are personalized as much as absolutely possible, and they are shareable. The goal is for these micro-credentials to be shareable, to signal to a larger audience that these are important. So how this looks in application is, if you see the graph on the right side, this is kind of our entire program system, our system of our licensure programs, is at the point of which they engage with us as a service cooperative, as a licensing entity, we'll design their program based on whatever experiences they have in their background. So there are standards. There are licensure standards that every candidate must have assurance of competence in order for a license to be granted to them. We will look at those standards at the micro level and say, if they have some level of expertise that is not necessary, that could be any type of level of expertise, if they could provide evidence of competence in any of those standards, we then at that point decide that they don't need to relearn that content. They don't need to provide any further evidence. If it's known, it's known, and there's evidence, it's evidence. We move on. So the micro-credential process is actually for whatever's missing. So if there's 15 licensure standards around construction careers, and they have years of experience doing construction, a vast majority of those content standards are likely going to be able to be proven competence through some sort of documentation process. They're not going to have to worry about engaging in informal and somewhat formal education to do that. But let's say that they're missing 2 standards. They will then be able to engage with us. We'll do a professional development around those specific standards through the micro-credentialing process. Once they've obtained the micro-credential by providing evidence that's vetted by an outside source, they are now They prove competence in all of those licensure standards. So that, in essence, is kind of what our whole picture looks like. The intention is again, we don't have opportunities for our teachers in Minnesota to obtain these CTE licenses. Their only opportunities right now are one higher education institution, but they have to go through they have to go through a baccalaureate program and then it's a post-baccalaureate program, or through a portfolio process, which is pretty cumbersome. It's doable for those who have content, but those who do not have content, it's simply just not doable. So again, our initial program is our licensure program will be for initially already licensed teachers in Minnesota that are looking to add another license. However, that doesn't preclude us from the fact that down the road we'll very likely be offering initial licenses. We're just in a situation where this is somewhat politically tenuous, because we, again, are a non-institution of higher education offering something that generally and traditionally has always been offered in IHEs. So with that, I'll pass the baton.
Excellent, and thank you to all of you for those overviews of your strategies and also overviews of each of your institutions and entities that you're representing today. We do have a number of questions, and once again, I encourage participants to continue sending those questions in. But I'm going to start off with a specific question for Washington, and then a question that will go to Georgia and to the whole panel. So for the first question, it's how is work experience determined for the teachers in Washington, those that are coming through Route 2, and how is their experience verified?
Okay, so for the Plan 2 route, and actually for both routes, work experience, we actually, it's documented through the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, the certification department, and it's based on a Washington Administrative Code. For in-service teachers, 300 hours of recent teaching can partially fulfill the work experience requirement, but we feel very strongly. I was actually in a meeting on Monday with what we call our Professional Education Standards Board to discuss CTE teacher certification, and this actually came up, and we feel very strongly that CTE teachers must have related experience just in order to be better teachers, to be able to relate their experiences within the classroom. I, as a teacher preparation person can advise candidates about what type of work experience may qualify, but the final decision does come from our certification, our state certification office. At the meeting on Monday, the idea came up, or the issue came up, about whether volunteer work qualifies. Previously, only paid employment qualified, but they are now accepting some volunteer service. They look at it and scrutinize it very carefully. To verify, to answer the question about how do they verify it, we have a form that all of our candidates fill out, and they document their 6,000 hours in the specific area, and that verification can come from letters from past employers indicating how long the candidate worked. They can submit pay stubs, they can submit W-2s, they can also submit volunteer hours now that can be verified by whatever the agency or entity where they did their volunteer work, and that all is put on a form. We call it 4075H or 4075I, depending on which type of work and certification they're looking for. I hope that answers your question. If not, please ask further.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask the next question. A few questions have come in around funding. So one that was very specific to Georgia about how you fund the Targeted Support and Improvement, the TSI. Is that funded through state or federal funds or in some other way? And to the larger panel, I would ask if you could also just give a brief response for how your strategies have been funded to date and or how you anticipate them being funded as you move forward. So let's first start with Georgia.
Okay, the CTI coordinator is typically a part of the special education department, and salaries are typically covered that way, but that doesn't necessarily have to be. In some districts, I think CTAE is covering salaries and benefits for some of our coordinators. There is a benefit toward FTE monies that can be available as long as CTI services are written into the student's IEP service page. When that happens, as long as those students are seen on FTE count day, they not only earn the K-weight for CTAE students, but they can also earn a special ed weight in addition to that. So I hope that provides some information as to how those positions are funded.
Mm-hmm. And do any of the other panelists want to weigh in briefly on some of the funding pieces, both either currently and or what you anticipate for some of the strategies that you've referenced?
This is Kim from Washington State, and our researches are purely funded through the Professional Ed Standards Board and the Washington State Legislature. If they're required by PESB, then the legislature is required to fund, to provide funding for the courses.
This is Troy in Minnesota, and we're in a unique situation too because nobody's ever done this type of work through alternative teacher preparation. So at the same time that the statute changed and our tiered licensure system changed, we were able to get a legislative allocation through a grant process for alternative teacher preparation, which we were awarded a $150,000 grant to build these programs. But I will also be very honest that a lot of the work around the initial provider approval or unit approval was simply just done gratis by me because we feel so strongly about the need for these types of programs. You know, and there's an unsustainability piece with providing anything gratis, but it was time to get movement towards further opportunities. And of course, when students become or candidates become enrolled in any sort of opportunity with us, there will be fees that will be associated to that. But because they're not graduate coursework or credit or learning for professional development for credit, we have several districts that are very likely and interested in providing actually the cost of bearing the cost for those for that professional development, because it really benefits the district as well to have people that are professionally licensed in those fields.
Tamara, this is Lynn. I just wanted to add in here some thoughts and maybe some probes for the audience as well as the panel in terms of leveraging funds, whether through ESSA, the state ESSA plans, and the Title funds. Title II funds can be used for induction of teachers, and then there's opportunities for teacher academies. So when we talk about building the skill sets of CTE teachers to be able to support students with disabilities, those are some options, either through the creation of teacher academies using ESSA funds or through induction programs for teachers. So once CTE teachers, so once they are hired, that you can provide some ongoing professional learning in that way. Also, IDEA funds, the discretionary funds, could potentially be used to providing professional development and training for CTE teachers as well, and supporting students with disabilities. So some options out there that could be leveraged if not already doing so.
Great. That's excellent. And we actually have a slew of additional questions, and so one of them I'm going to turn into a two-part question. It was initially directed to Minnesota, and it talked about how the competency models in Minnesota were very different. But it also wanted, the participant also wanted to know if you could speak to any challenges that you've met along the way, particularly any pushback from the general public or other audiences, given that the model was innovative and different. Before I give Troy the opportunity to answer that first specific to Minnesota, I actually want to pose that question in a much broader way to the entire panel. What are some of the challenges that you've met along the way with the strategies that you have described to us? And then also, what are either some current successes that you are having, whether they're small ones or large ones, that you could share with us? So I'm going to start with Troy. Challenges and any successes, even though this is fairly new and innovative and different.
Thanks, Jamar, and that's a great question, and I'll just say that we don't have enough time to talk about all the challenges. There's a very, let's be very blunt and honest, there's a very political motivation to maintain the status quo, but the maintenance of status quo around teacher preparation in Minnesota has provided us with nobody coming into the field within CTE. CTE licensure in and of itself is I think we all know it's expensive to provide CTE teacher preparation programs, particularly through institutions of higher education. They're expensive. They're very expensive programs, and we don't have a number of folks that are entering the field in a way that can engage with higher education in the way that traditionally higher education provides these proper opportunities. So there's just, the business model is just not there to be able to sustain it in higher education. So alternative teacher preparation in general in Minnesota was very contentious for a period of time, but because the CTE portion is looked at so differently, we've not had a significant amount of for the lack of a better way to say, blowback from the general public, or even the or teachers, or really anybody, with the exception of a few entities that want to protect their own interest, which is understandable, completely understandable. The barriers oftentimes for us, because we have, as an institution that's not higher ed, still have to meet the same criteria and standards for unit approval or institutional approval, as well as program approval, as the higher education institutions have to, which is I don't have a problem with. I think if we did anything less than that, we would be viewed as lesser than. Problem is those standards are all written in higher education language. It requires credits. It requires, it doesn't require courses, but it refers to courses, refers to credits. It refers to faculty, which in Minnesota, faculty by rule is actually post-secondary teachers. It's been very difficult to navigate the process that was built for an institution that's very, very, very different for which we are. So that's been probably the biggest barrier. We're still fighting with some of those barriers simply because we're going through the program process right now, which again requires us to put course numbers in. Well, we don't provide courses. It requires us to enter a GPA. Well, we don't provide GPAs. It requires us to ask a number of credits per course. Well, we don't provide credits. So it's the systemic pieces are what have probably been the most difficult. There's been a significant desire for things to change, so therefore we're not getting it on that end. It's been just literally the systemic infrastructural pieces that have been the most difficult. So as far as success, hey, we made it. We are the first institution in Minnesota that is non-higher ed that has been approved to provide teacher preparation programs. That's long time in the making. We now have blown that door off the hinges, and we know we have 3 or 4 other entities that are coming behind us looking to do more types of opportunities within teacher preparation that are outside of just CTE, because it's not just a CTE issue. So I think with that I'll let other people talk, but it's been incredibly challenging, but it's been incredibly rewarding that hopefully we'll be able to provide some services that we wouldn't be able to in other times.
Great, thank you. Others?
I would like to say, from Georgia's perspective, I guess with the challenges, we meet quarterly with our certifying agency, which is the Georgia Professional Standards Commission, who certifies teachers for the state, to have discussions with them about the challenges as far as getting teachers certified and programs in the state that can help get teachers certified. Teachers that take non-traditional paths, we do have 3 universities that help us with the career tech teacher preparation programs, and that's the University of Georgia, Georgia State University, and Valdosta State University. And they work with those teachers that come out of business and industry to certify those teachers in their specific program areas.
And this is Kim from Washington, and I'll just readily admit that our biggest challenge is a shortage of CTE teachers. And right now, I think my biggest fight is trying to stop the state from watering down the requirements when what we really should be doing is ramping them up, especially in this area of students with disabilities. But right now, more the challenge is that we really have very limited pre-service training, and then mostly what happens, the success would be that in our state, as far as working with students with disabilities, that has fallen and been funded primarily at the school district level, where we have special education directors and teachers who actually work directly with our CTE teachers to train them and to help them work with each student individually and address that student's particular needs. But it is a challenge, and that is a weakness in our area, in our state at least.
Excellent. Thank you for each of you for your responses to that question. And I think the variety in your responses is very telling. And what I'm going to do, we do have some other questions, and we will circle back to them, but I think this is a wonderful time to actually turn our attention to the national perspective. And I'm going to turn it over to Lynn Holdehide, who is going to provide some overall reflections, themes, and recommendations. And then we will circle back to additional Q&A from participants. So please keep your questions coming in, and we will continue to ask them of our panelists. Lynn, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jamar, and thanks to the panelists. Quite a lot of great information that's shared today related to the topic. And, you know, I think it's not a surprise for everyone who joined today that in order for students with disabilities to have an equitable access to CTE programs, CTE teachers need to be prepared. As Kimberly, I think it was Kimberly that mentioned right at the tail end of this last question, shortages. We know that there are shortages in CTE teachers as well as with all teachers. In particular, we mentioned the shortages in CTE teachers earlier, but there's 48 states in the District of Columbia who cite that there are special education teacher shortages as well. So that just complicates the issue even a little bit more, in that we're just losing teachers. And as Kimberly mentioned, there's just this movement to lessen requirements, whether it be CTE teachers, special ed teachers, any teacher, because of the shortages across the nation. And what we're starting to see is some modifications in certification and licensure as sort of I would say a knee-jerk reaction to the fact that we just don't simply have enough teachers in the field. Now, of course, there's a supply and demand issue, and we certainly want more teachers because we don't want classrooms without teachers. But the consequence of all of this is going to be having less than prepared teachers in a classroom, and a CTE teachers is in that same boat. I think what complicates it even more with CTE, and we've all referenced this earlier, is the way in which CTE teachers are prepared and what's required, how they're recruited. Is it through alternative preparation? Is it through a traditional preparation program? All of them have benefits, and all of them have some challenges to it, obviously, because if you're going through a complete certification program, that gives you an opportunity to ensure that these teachers, CTE teachers, are very well prepared and have the pedagogical skills needed to support students with disabilities. But at the same hand, it's often hard to get industry experts, et cetera, to come back to school, to pay that kind of money, to go back through a program, to become a CTE teacher and potentially make less money than they were in the field. And then through an alternative program, it may or may not have enough time, seat time, whether practice time or seat time, to really get into the skill sets that are needed to support students with disabilities within these courses. I've been in special education for a long time, and unfortunately some of this conversation has not changed enough. We know that all students need to be transitioned and ready for secondary and post-school. And I think there's a couple of things from a national perspective that we have going for us. One is the career readiness aspect. We know that not just students with disabilities, but all students need to exit school career ready. And we've started to see through state ESSA plans and their accountability measures, career readiness as an aspect. So I think there's some opportunity there if a state has chosen or elected to use career readiness as one of their indicators, as a need to really reinforce, especially if they're reporting out for subgroups of students with disabilities, how can the students participating in CTE coursework be demonstrated that they're more career ready when they exit? So I think that's an impetus to put some pressure upon the states, the programs, everything that's out there, and use the funding so that we can ensure that students with disabilities can be integrated within these courses, as well as do so successfully with the kind of services that they need. The GTL Center some time ago, and I think we'll put up a link here in a minute, did a study of certification requirements, and I don't think it's changed that much for CTE teachers. And as we've all heard, they've been sort of very different depending on the state, and it always comes down to, do the CTE teachers have enough pedagogical skills to support students with disabilities? And then it also comes down to the issues of shortages. What are we going to do when we know we don't have enough teachers? Are we going to lessen the requirements, et cetera? When you look at what helps, obviously early planning. Anybody who does secondary transition planning for students with disability knows the importance of that, and ensuring that, I think somebody mentioned earlier, level the playing field. I enjoyed listening about Georgia's CTI program. I can't remember exactly what CTI stands for, but as a preparation program to enter into the CTEAE courses. And I think going to that, we just need to make sure that we're always equipping the students and the teachers, of course, but most particularly the students, that they can be successful. What are the experiences that can happen from, quite frankly, back from preschool all the way up to when they're in high school, so they have the skill sets necessary to thrive within a CTE program. Obviously, more training and supports for CTE teachers in really understanding accommodations, what type of pedagogy can be used in classrooms, and really having access to the IEPs. I'm still boggled by the fact that that's still an issue, but I hear it over and over again, where teachers, CTE teachers, are saying, I have students with disabilities in my coursework, in my classrooms, in my programs, but I don't even have their IEPs. Nobody's even talked to me about it. So the importance of collaboration is really important. And I think we're going to be coming out with a new report, both the GTL Center and the CCRS Center, as well as Advanced CTE, that basically summarizes what states are doing to encounter the fact that we have less than qualified or not enough CTE teachers. And in that report, there will be some recommendations around, what do you do when you have shortages? And one of the recommendations is, collaborative teaching or co-teaching. We know that that's a strategy we used in academic courses. It's also a strategy that can be used in CTE courses. So that way we are sharing knowledge and helping the CTE teacher learn how to accommodate and meet the needs of these students in their classrooms. So I think that is going to continue to be important. The last thing I want to talk about is the professional learning piece. Many of you mentioned it, especially when we know we have shortages. There could be an opportunity here that we're going to limit the requirements and getting more CTE teachers into play. Knowing that is a high likelihood, what can we do to continue to support their development across the career continuum once they're in? So not stopping at certification, but really thinking about the induction aspect. I mentioned earlier, and I know it was included there was a resource included in the chat box, that there's some opportunities within ESSA to leverage some funding in Title II. There's some opportunities within IDEA through discretionary dollars to leverage funding relative to induction as well. And that's going to be important, because no matter what state you're in, you probably are experiencing shortages. And even if you aren't experiencing shortages, right now there is so much that needs to be covered, whether it be through alternative prep or regular prep. There's so much that needs to be covered that it's almost next to impossible to cover everything, to know that these CTE teachers, or any teacher for that matter, are going to exit these programs as experts. So we have to take them from novices to experts, and the only way to do that is to create a system of professional development. And I heard many of you talk about that. How are we developing? There's the micro-credentials. How do you know that they have those skill sets? What are some ways to demonstrate? And I think that I can't underscore that enough, along with the panelists, about what is it that these teachers need to know to be successful to support students with disabilities. We all know that Most teachers get one course that talks about, what are the disabilities, what are the legal requirements, and we know that that doesn't really help them teach. What is it that they need to know when they're walking into a classroom? They've got several kids that have an IEP and need some accommodations. How can they teach the content so that these students can be successful in the CTE courses, whether it be through grades or whether it be through some sort of certification requirement at the end of the program? And I do want to spend a little bit of time about that. I think what I see across the nation is more of a swell in focusing on what is it that that teachers in general need to know, and how do we demonstrate competencies in that, whether it be through competency-based education or whether it be through micro-credentials. It's all coming towards the same thing. What are the skill sets that are needed that we know will help these teachers be successful in supporting students with disabilities? So I think there does need to be some focus there, because you can't add 7 more courses on to get a CTE teacher certified. There's just, as someone said earlier, the cost is prohibitive to do that. So we really need to hone in on what the skill sets and the skill sets that those teachers need, and how do we train them up on that as CTE teachers. I am going to mention, and I know at the very end of the slide deck there are resources related to this, but there is a lot of work going on between the Cedar Center, the Center on Great Teachers and Leaders, also the Council for Exceptional Children, and also the Chief State School Officers are working together on high leverage practices. And these are practices that if all teachers could use in any classroom, whether it be a CTE program, whether it be an academic classroom, it doesn't matter. But if all teachers were able to utilize these skills, the instruction would be better, students would have better access to the content in the curriculum. And they're called high leverage practices. There's some resources that are out about them. Jenna will post a link to some videos that are available that can be used as PD resources to train up teachers, but they're practices that are very familiar to all of us. How are you providing coaching and feedback? How are you providing modeling? How are you providing explicit instruction? How are you scaffolding the lesson? And, for somebody who's in special ed, that all sounds like, well, yeah, we know how to do that. But when you think about CTE teachers not having access and opportunity to learn the pedagogy piece, these are important skill sets at the very minimum to be able to provide CTE teachers with the skills to implement HLPs, these high leverage practices, the better off we are. And so when we think about, from a national perspective, what is it that we need teachers to know, whether it be through a micro-credential certification, what have you, thinking about the skill sets and access to the curriculum. And if we could offer CTE teachers an opportunity to learn high leverage practices, maybe 10 of them, they would feel much better prepared to support students with disabilities in their programs and in their classrooms. We've heard it for a number of years. There's not access for students with disabilities into these programs, and some of it is there's this belief system that students with disabilities can't succeed, and it also is coupled with the fact that teachers just simply don't feel prepared. So if we can arm them with some of these practices, whether it be at the initial certification or whether it be through induction and mentoring and professional learning, I think we'd have much more success, and not only students being offered these opportunities, but also to be successful in these programs. And I don't think it's, well, I will say that we're at a time where we are ensuring every student, no matter their background, have an equitable opportunity to access curriculum, access opportunities post-school. We need to be very conscientious about what we're dumping onto certification requirements and be very selective about what we're doing. And that's where I see across the nation a real swell and interest in the high leverage practices, because they seem obtainable, and it starts as a foundation to ensure that at least in these classrooms, teachers feel competent and feel like they have something to offer for students who struggle. And I think that's one of the main reasons that we see CTE teachers maybe a bit resistant to having students with disabilities enter their classrooms. That's a fair lot of information, but when I think about strategies, one is to really take a look at whether it be through alternative certification, however teachers are certified, what is it that they're learning to support students with disabilities, and really honing in on that, because we can't add 7 more courses. Let's be very selective on what we're doing there, and then making sure that there's a professional learning system and support, so that way when these CTE teachers are implementing these strategies, they're being able to be provided coaching and feedback along the way. Secondly, planning early. Always plan early for the teachers, for the students. We've seen externships, we've seen co-teaching, as I mentioned. Any of those things are an opportunity for both teachers to learn as well as for students to learn, so that we're planning early and we're setting up the foundation for students to succeed when they enter these courses. Collaboration. Some of you mentioned the need for collaboration across teachers, allowing time for CTE teachers, academic teachers, as well as special education specialists to collaborate, to come up with plans to support students as they enter these courses. You know, these are all not silver bullets. They're strategies and systems that need to be put into place. But I really feel confident that once we build the skill sets of CTE teachers, we will have more students entering the field, and I think entering into CTE coursework and exiting school career ready. We know our post-school outcomes are not as good as they need to be, and we know we need to increase opportunities. So I think along with ESSA and the focus on career readiness, some of the funding, and the focus on what we're arming these CTE teachers with, we have an opportunity here to make a difference. So we're not having the same conversation 10 years from now. And I'll stop there, Jamar, and see if people have questions or any comments from the panelists to follow up with what I said.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Lynn. And we actually do have a number of questions, some of which relate to what you've just laid out, particularly quality. And so framing it in how you just described some of our potential strategies that we could be thinking about both from a state level and a national perspective in our systems of professional development and the entirety of alternative routes to certification and the professional learning systems for our CTE teachers. There is a question and a concern related to quality, and so I pose this to any of you on the panel who would like to respond to it. But what is either the concern or the piece that you have implemented where you are that makes you comfortable with the quality of the alternative routes to certification and or the system of professional development for CTE teachers to support students with disabilities? And then also tied to that is also the rigor and how, when we do feel comfortable with the quality, how do we ensure that that quality and the rigor that goes along with being a part of a CTE program is communicated and conveyed to the different audiences, including parents and students themselves and other teachers. So it's a two-part question, but we had many questions come in with the quality as the theme piece. And so I'm going to turn it over to members of the panel to respond.
I can start. This is Troy. So the beauty of micro-credentials is the entire purpose and the entire focus is on the ability for a candidate to prove competence in whatever standard or whatever micro-credential that is. It's not necessarily focused so much on the content, but on the ability to actually show evidence of that particular standard or that particular micro portion of a standard, that they actually have the ability to actually do it and show competence in it. So that's one of the pieces that I think is so appealing about micro credentials. It's an action formulated result. One thing that I keep coming back to, and I think we have to be very, very careful about, and I could speak of this from Minnesota side, and I'm not going to speak to Washington or speak to Georgia about licensure in general, is that a license, particularly in Minnesota, and I would argue anywhere, doesn't necessarily assure quality teacher. A license is simply an assurance of minimum competence. So to use licensure and assume quality all of the time, or assume a high level of quality, is, I think, sometimes a fallacy, and we have to be a little bit careful about drawing that line, because it's going to imply that anybody that has a license is an excellent teacher. It's much more complex than that, and that's the beauty of a system that is so individualized, like what we're trying to accommodate here, because then we'll have that ability to be one-on-one in designing a set of educational learning experiences that these candidates are going to be required to show competence. It's not just saying that they took a course. And again, this is not a dig at higher ed or anything. It's simply just it's just the process for the system for which we've created. So it really is focused on competence and quality, and we have to make sure that we're really being very intentional about our language about those types of things.
Okay. And Troy, I would agree with you on that. This is Kim in Washington State, and what we do is, for all of our programs, is we require evidence through the submission of artifacts that show that the student or the candidate has met the qualifying requirements. Another area that we actually are allowed to address in our programs is disposition, which some people refer to as the affective part of in this case, a teacher. So we are allowed to address people who we might feel might not be quality teachers, or might not belong in the program or in the classroom. And not only are we allowed to do that, but I have done that in the past. I don't have to very often, but once in a while, as you all know, you get someone who just doesn't belong in the classroom, and we are allowed to use that disposition to counsel them in another direction. As far as the stigma related to CTE, the stigma occurs that I've experienced comes from people who have never experienced CTE. Once a parent or a community member or a student gets involved in a CTE program, they can be our biggest fans, but they, of course, as you can imagine, there's a lot of turf wars going on, and so you hear the negative aspects of it that I hear honestly come from people who don't know CTE. And I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thank you for your responses.
I'll just jump in.
Perfect.
I'll just jump in a little bit about the, alternative cert. I think there's so much variance in alternative certification, and I know that the national, I'm going to mess this up, the National Center for Alternative Certification and prep programs has come up with some quality indicators, which I think does provide some level of foundation in terms of the quality of alternative prep programs. But I would echo what was previously said. Certification doesn't mean necessarily a level of expertise. And I think the use of micro-credentials and things that are more competency-based give us more assurance. We're only going to be learner ready when we exit prep programs, and so there's going to need to be professional learning that's coupled with that, so you can move to a level of expertise and competence.
Excellent. And I recognize that we are about 2 minutes from our intended conclusion, and we still have a few questions left that we would not be able to get to. And so what we do plan to do is circle back with each of our panelists and presenters and ask them to provide some responses to the questions that apply to them and the perspectives that they bring to the table. And we hope to post those responses for you on our website, where we will also be featuring today's PowerPoint and resources, links to the resources that we have provided or that you have heard referenced by each of our panelists. I want to thank each of you, and I'd like to actually give each of you the last minute to minute and a half to give us one last word on why you feel this is important, and a continued call to action or most favored strategy that you feel that we should pursue if we are at the state level or the district level. So I'm going to start with our friend from Washington, Dr. Bartel.
Well, I can't answer all of those questions in that amount of time, but very briefly, I will tell you I was at a conference and a meeting, and the statistic I was given was that about 3 out of every 5 students in the state of Washington have some sort of disability or learning challenge, and I think that statistic right there stands for itself as far as the importance of this issue.
Great. Thank you for that response. And Georgia, our friends from Georgia.
Hey, this is Scott Chapin. I'm going to talk from, I guess, some real experiences of being a high school principal a couple of years ago. And I'm going to agree that certification doesn't mean that it's a great teacher or effective teacher, but Georgia has taken the stance that we need to be able to provide our teachers and our students with quality instructional resources and professional learning that can help our teachers be successful in the classroom.
Thank you. And Minnesota.
I think I would leave us with the thought that this is not our CTE programs, and having CTE teachers in our secondary schools is not a matter of continuation of programs, but it's a matter of economic and workforce vitality, and it's ultimately, it has to happen in order for us, our Minnesota economy, to maintain any level of competitiveness. So it's not just about teachers in the classroom, it's about our economic vitality.
And Lynn.
Yeah, I'll follow up with that in terms of outcomes for students, all students, but most particularly students with disabilities. We're entering a world where we really need to have a skill set in order to have a livable wage. And, there's a lot of opportunity within CTE certification, et cetera, to either go into an associate's program or exit with some sort of certificate to enter into a job that can help you live. And so it is about teacher skill sets, and it is about equity and opportunity to be part of these programs, but it's also about really looking forward to creating some positive post-school outcomes for students. All of this has to come together well in order for that to happen, and that starts with teachers being prepared.
Thank you so much for each of you for that final response and final word. And the last few slides that we have highlight some of the resources that you've heard referenced in today's webinar and panel presentation. And in addition, as we provide post information, we will be sure to include links to all of the resources that you've heard our panelists mention, and they should be on our website within 24 to 48 hours, along with today's slide deck. Thank you all so much for your participation. Thank you so much to all of our presenters and panelists, and for everyone who is doing work that is incredibly important for the post-secondary success of our students with disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
you.